Okay, welcome everybody to part 3 of the build a Fullstack application from scratch workshop. Today we will be building the front end for our application. So we already have on part 1 the Node.js code for it. On part 2 we did all the unit testing for it, and part 3 is all about the front end. So first I'm just going to quickly walk you through the final project. So it's going to be this app, what we will be building today. So it's just a very basic, simple note-keeping app that you can click on notes to view more details about them. You can click on Edit Note to edit that current note, make a change like so, save changes, and then it automatically updates your. It gives you that notes, that created notes details view. Then you can go back to home, and you can see now the same note with the details, and even create new notes. So just a standard CRUD. And also, because of course it's super important for every backend development, this will be including authentication. So it includes the ability to log in and log out of it and even create an account. So without any further ado, let's get started since we have quite a bit of work ahead of us. Now, right now, my current front end for my Just Jotted app is kind of barren, to be honest. I don't really have much. I literally just have an index.html page and a test page, which honestly aren't much to look at, as you will see very soon. So I'm going to start my application. Notice how you must have MongoDB started, because this connects to MongoDB. So I have it running on my other terminal right here. So yeah, that's running. Let's open localhost to see if that's working as expected. So let's go to localhost. And there we go. That's what we have right now, which honestly I know isn't very impressive, but that's okay. That's where we are. Now let's begin with this by first adding some boilerplate. I like to refer to boilerplate code to any code that isn't that important, but it's kind of necessary to have for this to work. So first I'm going to add some CSS. I'm not going to dig into much detail on the CSS because that's not really the focus of the workshop. So I'm just going to copy paste all my CSS for this application, which honestly isn't a lot. Like it's what, 100 lines of code? Yeah, it's 100 lines of code, including media queries, and it's mostly just very basic styling, like setting a custom font, like setting custom padding, spacing, borders, etc. So it's very basic CSS, as you probably saw already. So yeah, that's our CSS file, and it's time to improve our index.html page. So let's open our index.html, and first things first, I'm going to make sure that inside of my head I'm going to include a few things. So I'm going to include number 1, a different title. That's pretty boring. So our title is going to be home just jotted, and I'm going to import my just jotted CSS file, and this is something I really like to use on all my projects. It's Google Fonts. So Google Fonts has a huge free online repository of fonts you can use, and I really like using the Roboto family of fonts because they look really good to me. And you can just visit fonts at google.com, click on plus, and once you're done selecting fonts, it's just a matter of copy pasting the CSS into yours, and you're done. You have that font free to use. So yeah, cool stuff. Now that is pretty much done. So let's add some very basic content on our page. So let's just add a simple just jotted page, and yeah, that's just about it. Let's just add this quick maybe welcome message, so something like this, and yeah, I think that should be more than enough. Let's load this page up. Oh, before I forget, we forgot all our pages are going to be using jQuery, so let's not forget to load jQuery. There we go, and that's pretty much it. Let's refresh the page. And there we go. That looks. Oh, don't tell me I'm not sharing. Oh, yes, I am sharing my screen. Can everybody else see the screen sharing? It appears to me I am. I think you might have to rejoin the session because yeah, it looks like it's a minor bug with the session application. Feel free to just refresh the page. That should fix it, I think. But yeah, thank you everybody for chiming in to help me. I was actually, holy crap! Imagine starting the session 5 minutes in and nobody told me. But yeah, no problem. So yeah, let's continue with this. So this is already looking pretty nice, but I guess it's just basic CSS, right? Now, I could start coding this basic page by just adding an index.js file, which is going to be used by my index.html, and start coding everything. I could start coding everything ranging from I don't know, the logic on how to go to login, or basically because this is my dashboard, I want that by default it loads my to-dos or my notes as a user. But if I do that, what will probably end up happening is my index.js will grow super large in size. It will be like maybe 400, 500 lines long, even longer probably. And to avoid that, I'm going to be modularizing my code from the start. So to do that, I need to think of the biggest main actions I will do on this application. So these are 4 actions, and for each one of them, I'm going to write my own module for each of those actions. So I'm going to write a utilities folder. So instead of utilities, I'm going to store all my modules. So I'm going to create 4 main modules for the biggest actions I'm going to constantly be doing. So I'm going to create an http.module.js. Now, in this HTTP module, I will do all my server-side calls. So anything that I have to do, jQuery.request, I don't know, request a to-dos, or try to make a login request or a sign-up request. I will put all of this in this file, so it's easy to manage all the calls in just one file. I will also need, very probably, a render module, because I will be rendering actual HTML in the page with jQuery. So I'm also going to build basically a component just for that specific action, so rendering. And then I'm also going to be needing caching. So caching basically just means that if the user logs in, once they log in, you need a way to save the JSON Web Token in memory, because if you refresh the page, then you want the user to still be logged in. And to do that, we could use cookies, but we're not going to use cookies because they weren't designed for that. So we're going to use something called local storage that allows you to save JavaScript variables, and it allows you to save them in basically like a persistent type of memory that when you close the browser and reopen it, the variable will still be there. So to access this data, we're going to create this cache module to access, save, and delete data from this cache memory. And finally, we're going to create one last module called the etc. module, because anything that doesn't really fit in the other modules is going to go in etc. And the other main purpose of why we do this modularization from the start is because that way, these can all be imported into any page and just be reused. So it makes our functions much more reusable, and also it makes our pages just much smaller in size. So let's begin with that. With that in mind, we need to also add some basic structure to our modules. So on each one of those, let's begin. What could we start doing? Because our index.js page is kind of barren. So let's begin with our index.js page and progressively add logic as we need it. So first things first, I'm going to add my function for on-page load. So my function for on-page load is going to look a bit like this. So function on page load, and this is a function that will be executed automatically when the page finishes loading. I like to wrap it up in a jQuery document .ready event handler, and the reason why I like to do this is because this makes sure that this function will only run once the page has completely finished loading. So yeah, basically that's pretty much it for that. What are we missing? We probably need to add some very basic functionality to show like a nice view depending if the user is logged in or not. So for that, I'm going to change my index.html quite a bit. So my index.html that has the grading right here is going to change into something like this. So please bear with me because it might look kind of weird at first. Okay, so this is what we're going to greet the user with. So when they first visit our page, we're going to have the section for notes list, which is we're going to actually inject all the notes from the server. But the nav is the interesting part. So because there's 2 types of users we need to cater for. We need to cater for authenticated users and non-authenticated users. So for that, what I like to do is I create 2 submenus, one called default menu and the other is the auth menu. And they're both hidden by default. Like if I refresh the page and I save this and refresh, you will notice that by default, it shows nothing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first check if the user is logged in or not. And depending on that, I will be showing one of those 2, depending on the state of the user. So because I want to check if the user is logged in or not from the cache, I'm going to begin writing my cache module. So I'm going to add a function that is called get authenticated user from cache. So this function, which I am adding right here, this is using something called local storage. So if you want to learn more about local storage, which I encourage you to do because it's a really cool feature of browsers, just search for local storage, Mozilla Developer Network, and they have fantastic examples that teach you about how local storage works, how to save items into it, how to get items from local storage. So definitely check this out. It's really cool. So yeah, we're going to be using local storage to get a lot of values from it. So we're going to get the JSON Web Token, we're going to get the user ID, the username, the name, and the email. And then we're going to check if the JSON Web Token does exist, and if it does, we return an actual object with all the keys. However, if there's no JSON Web Token, it means he is not logged in, so we return undefined. And that's our handy reusable function right here. Now, I'm going to also add 3 more functions because we will be using them eventually. Maybe not yet, but we will be using them. So one is save authenticated user into cache. So this is a function we'll probably use once the user logs in successfully. So if he can log in, then basically we will get the user that just logged in and save it into cache. So we can basically re-grab this user once the user refreshes the page. And finally, the delete authenticated user from cache, which will be used once the user tries to log out. Because when you log out, you want to delete all his cookies and documents because, you know, he logged out, right? So let's stop giving him access to the site. And finally, this is pretty much all we need. And while we could use these functions as well, we're not going to do that because that's not very clean or tidy. So what I like to do is I create a new property on the window object. So this window cache module property will be basically the way I access this cache module. So I'm going to access window.cache module, and that will allow me to have access to all the 3 functions I built. For those unfamiliar with window, window is basically a fancy way of saying I'm declaring a browser global. So by doing window.something, you're creating a variable that will be available to access by any file in the entire project. So this is basically just a fancy way of saying we're creating a global that can be accessed by all JavaScript files. So that's pretty much it for cache module. Let's go back to our index so we can actually start using that cache module. So we should begin by importing our cache module like so. So at the first line, I'm going to do const cache module. And also, I'm going to create a new variable called state because I want to store anything related to the state of the app into this variable so that I want to create as few globals as possible. The reason is because when you start working on large projects, everybody starts creating globals all over the place. So the least amount of globals you can create, the better. That way you can conflict less with other developers. So yeah, that's our state global, and now it is time to actually test our functionality. So first things first, I'm going to build a nice and handy function called update authenticated UI. So it's this function I'm going to write right here. So this function is kind of self-explanatory. So it will update the UI of our app depending if the user is authenticated or not. So just before that, let me just quickly disable project. Let me open my project configuration because I'm getting quite a few errors. Preferences, workspace settings. There's a setting here that's really clashing with the errors I'm getting. TypeScript, check.js. That's weird. Should be off, but okay. Hopefully that will get rid of a few errors. So this function called update authenticated UI, this is a really handy function that basically it will automatically show one of these 2 submenus. So if the user is logged in, it will show the auth menu, but if he isn't logged in, it will show the default menu. And the way we do this is I do cache.get authenticated user from cache. So I'm going to open my cache function so you can see them side by side. So this will retrieve the logged in user from the cache if it exists, and if it does, I do an if auth user exists, and if it does, then I add my auth user to my state. And then once that happens, I use jQuery to select my nav greeting and my auth menu and unhide it basically. So if I put it below it like so, you can see that I'm going to be selecting nav greeting. So this nav greeting here, I change it to welcome and the username. And as far as the auth menu, which is this auth menu, I remove the hidden so that it can be shown indeed. And if he's not authenticated, then I instead show that default menu, which is the one on top. So if we save this and refresh index.js, we should be seeing that very soon. But before that, you need to make sure of two things which are critical for this to work. Because number one, we added JavaScript code for our index.js page. So you know what, let me rename that to be a bit more explicit. Let's rename this to index.page just to make it a bit more obvious. And now I need to make sure I add my index.js page. Super important, you need to make sure you always load jQuery before all of your code because you're probably using it. So the order of the code matters as for the order of execution. And also because we're using our cache module, we're going to be loading our cache module like so. And because you know what, I'm really forgetful or paranoid, I'm just going to load all of them from the start, even if I'm not really needing all of them. So I'm just going to add them because I know how forgetful I am. So in case I need anything from one of the other modules, I already loaded them on my index. So that's pretty much done. Let's open our localhost page and see what it looks like so far. So if I refresh it, okay, so that's not working. Let's see why. Maybe I'm seeing an error. Okay, no error. What could we be doing? Oh, of course. We wrote our update authenticated UI function, but we forgot to execute it. So that's kind of a big mess up. Let's fix that right about now. Okay. And yeah, let's save that. And let's refresh the page. Let me just put this like so. Refresh. And there we go. That looks much better. So now if you're not logged in, it gives you this message, but if you are, it allows you to actually log in. So how about we build the logic to actually log in? So let's do that. Let us begin with the piece of functionality for the login. And so let's add a new folder called auth. Just auth. Now instead of auth, we're going to create two pages. So login.html and sign up.html. Now let's begin with the sign up because that's where everything tends to start, right? So I have my sign up. I might as well just move all my modules to the right in case I need them. So there we go. So I'm going to begin with my sign up. So my sign up HTML, of course, needs quite a lot of boilerplate. So to skip that, because we only have an hour, I'm just going to add the entire boilerplate right now. I'm just going to quickly explain it. So basically, our sign-up code looks a bit like this. So you load, of course, the usual. So you load your basic CSS. You load your fonts if you need the fonts. At the end, don't forget to load your JavaScript. So I load my jQuery. I load all my modules in case I need them. And I load my actual JavaScript, which right now doesn't exist yet. It's called auth page. So I might as well create it, even if it's empty. So I'm going to add auth.page.js. And there we go. That's pretty much it as far as that goes. So that's pretty much the JavaScript side of things. And then the form is going to be very straightforward, very simple. It's just a header saying sign up. It has a form that has 4 fields: name, email, username, and password, and an input of type submit that says create account. There's nothing more to it. And then at the end, it's just a super tiny navigation bar that has 2 links: back to home, that takes you to index.html, and auth/login, which tells you if you already have an account, click here to log in. So that's pretty much it for the sign up. We might as well add the code for index so that we can easily navigate between those two just to test things work. Thankfully, the login is much simpler. So I actually copied over the wrong ones. Give me just 1 sec to fix that. So here's the code for login. There we go. So that's login, just jot it. And this time it's literally the same code from sign up, but we remove fields because for login, you only need username and password, not the name and not email. And the same thing goes, just different links instead of back to home. You have, instead of a link to sign up, you have a link to login and vice versa. And finally, you load all your JavaScript, which right now isn't very functional, but that's okay. We will be populating this very soon. So having said that, let's refresh the page to see if we can actually navigate between those. So I'm going to click on login. And there we go. We can navigate between them. I can click on back to home, and it takes me back to home. And if I click on create account, I can click here. It takes me to create account. So far they're already at least semi-functional. They do nothing yet, but we're getting there. So that's pretty much it. Now, as far as to add actual logic to it, let's begin adding the logic. How about for our sign-up page? I think our sign-up page is a pretty good candidate for that. So let us begin adding logic to it, like so. So we, as always, we begin with some very basic boilerplate. So we do that document and dot ready, and then the on page load function, and then instead of it, we want to do two things. So we want to listen, because we're going to be using, I want you to notice how am I using this auth page on both my sign up and login. Why? Because honestly, they have so little code. I decided to just put them in one file because you're going to be surprised. There's just so little code for these 2 pages. So I just grouped it in one file, and I'm going to listen for events on both the sign up and login form. So when you click or you do the submit or of each of those forms, it's going to trigger a different function. So on sign up submit and on login submit. And each of these functions is also going to be very, very clean, and you will see very soon why. So let me just write them first, like without no content. So on sign up submit and function on login submit. Now, before I add them, because these will essentially all that we will be doing is doing an HTTP request to the server to try to log in or sign up, I'm going to be building them inside of the HTTP module. So I'm going to add the 2 functions in and just quickly explain them. So these are the functions we will be using now. So there's 2 functions, one for sign up and one for login. Now, note how inside, all I'm literally doing is doing the AJAX call, but I'm extracting from, I'm receiving an object that is the options object, and inside of it I have properties like the user data that is trying to sign up, and 2 functions, an on success and on error, that get called if the request succeeds or if it doesn't. And this allows me to just call sign up user in a much cleaner way instead of just having to add this code into my auth page, which just makes it look so much fat and more difficult to understand, you know. And the same goes for login. Login is the same, only the route changes. Instead of being API/user, it's API auth login. So yeah, that's pretty much our both requests. It's time to export our HTTP module. So let's do that right now. Window.http module equals, and a new object that has the property sign up user and login user. Okay, now with that said, let's add, that's pretty much it, all we need as far as how to enable the actual login and sign up. So let's do that right now. Let's add an event to both, because we want to disable the form's default behavior, because when you submit a form, it thinks you have to navigate away, so you don't want the form to navigate away. So I'm going to add event prevent default on both, because I do not want to navigate away. And then of course, when you try to sign up, which is our first handler, you want to extract the data from the sign up form. So if you look back on the sign up form, this is the inputs we have. So we extract the name. So as you can see, we extract the name via the ID of the input, the email input, the username input, and the password input. And I notice how I like to be very explicit with my IDs as well, just so that it's obvious for me what I'm actually importing. So this is name, text. So that tells me it's a text type input. And then I just extract the value with jQuery. So yeah, with that said, that allows me to create basically an object that has all the user's data. And then all I have to do is just import, which by the way, I haven't imported my modules yet. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to import 2 modules, because I think I need 2 modules on this page. And these are the HTTP module, which we just created, as well as the cache module, which you will see very soon why we import that. Okay, so with that said, we can now do, because we imported the HTTP module, so this object, we can now do HTTP dot, and we should be able to use sign up user. So sign up user. And this basically is a function that receives an object, as you can see, options object with user data, unsuccess, and an error. So let's provide that. So first we pass in user data, then we pass in an unsuccess function. So unsuccess, and unsuccess will be receive a user, and on error, let's also add an on error callback. So on error, we get an error. So what we're going to do is, number one, we're going to just do alert, and I don't know, let's do there was a problem processing your request. Please try again later. Okay, and if it is successful, then because this is just a sign up, we want to tell the user, hey, we were successful creating your user, so you need to go to the login page now. So to do that, we're going to use these two handle lines of code. So first, we're going to prompt the user an alert saying user, and then the created user's username, created, and you may now log in. And then we do window.open. That basically just is like doing a redirection. It reloads the page on this URL. And by adding the underscore self, it makes sure it doesn't open a new tab for it. And that's pretty much it for sign up. Let's now add the logic for on login, which will be very, very similar, as you will see very soon. So the login logic is going to be something like this, with only one very tiny but critical difference. So instead of user data, adding also the name and email, we just have username and password in this scenario. And then we call the HTTP login user function, as you can see here. We pass in the user data. The error is very similar, like incorrect username and password, please try again. However, the unsuccess is where things get really interesting. So once you are able to log in, we need to be able to cache this user, because once we log in, we're going to navigate away from this page and we're going to lose it. We're going to lose that logged in user's JSON Web Token. That's like his ID card to access protected assets and endpoints. So what we do right now is we proceed and basically create a new authenticated user variable. So we do const authenticated user, and we extract the user from the response. And then in this authenticated user, we add a new property called JSON Web Token, which we attach the JSON Web Token from the server. And then once we have this valid authenticated user that includes all the user data as well as the JSON Web Token, we pass it in to this cache function called save authenticated user into cache, this function right here. And that will automatically save all the properties of the user into the cache. So we call this function right here, and that makes sure that we now have this user's data saved into the cache. Then we can do login successful, redirecting you to home page, and then it does window.open and it redirects us to the home page. And that's pretty much it. That's our login page complete. So let's go back to home and refresh this page, because we pretty much should have a fully functional database. So before I do that, let me just quickly open my Mongo 3T instance so we can just monitor that this is in fact working as expected. So right now I have only one user called John Doe. So let me create a new one. I'm going to click on login because I want to create a username for myself. I don't have an account, so I'm going to click here to create a new one. And then I'm going to create one with all my data. So email sergey@gmail.com. Username is going to be Sergey, and password is just going to be, I don't know, let's say password 1. So password 1. Create account. User Sergey created. You may now log in. And basically, if you look at Roboto3T and I refresh the user's database, you can see that there is now a user for me because it actually made the call successfully. Now, the next step is to try to log in. So before I try to do that, I'm going to expand my network panel so you can see what it looks like. And I'm also going to filter by XHR, which are AJAX requests. So I'm going to try to log in with Sergey and password, which is password 1. And what's going to happen, and you know what, I'm just going to enable that debugger so you can see this, what's happening here in slow motion. When you actually try to submit basically a login, and I click login, you'll see that first it builds the user data from it. So here's the user data, the password 1 and username Sergey. And then when I try to log in user, if I click on enter the function with a debugger, it now shows me the login user function, which will actually do the AJAX call. So it will do the AJAX call to APIs auth login with the user data that, remember, it has to be parsed. Don't forget that Express servers need the data in JSON format. So you need to do JSON.stringify. And then if that's successful, if we go up a level on our call stack, I'm going to add a debugger breakpoint on success. So because it was successful, we have our valid JSON web token and our user. And then we build our authenticated user variable, and we're going to save it into the cache. Now, before I save it, I'm going to show you how cache works. So if I go to my application tab and then go to local storage, notice how I have nothing inside of local storage. There's nothing for localhost 8080. But as soon as I run that line, I'm going to click on step over. I now have all my data in the cache for local storage. So I can access this even if I close this Chrome tab. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that piece of code. It's now going to redirect me. If I click on play, it's going to redirect me to home. So you click on play, login successful, redirecting you to home page. And you will see that not only does it take me to home page, it gives me the authenticated user's UI because it detected that I still have in my cache the JSON web token, the email, name, user ID, and username. So that's pretty much it for authentication. Now it's time to actually load notes for when we load the index.js page. So let's do that right now. So let's open our index.js page. So it's this one. And I think basically most of the work is going to be happening on indexpage.js. So let's do that. How about here? Yeah, here's index.js page. Now, first things first, I want to make sure that I only fetch my to-dos, my notes, if the user is logged in. So I'm going to do if state.authUser. This is the auth user that gets saved into state if it's actually in the cache. So if he is in the cache, then to http dot, and right now I don't have a function yet, but I'm just going to type it out for the time being, get user notes. Now I don't have this yet, so I'm going to write this right now, and also I haven't imported my HTTP model, so I might as well import it as well. So here's my cache, and here is my HTTP module. No, let's build the HTTP function first, and then we'll move to the final step. So first things first, let's add that get user notes function. So that get user notes function is going to go right here. And it's also kind of straightforward. It is similar to above in that it has its own options object. It has the on success, on error. But notice this critical part, the JSON web token. Because my server side has protected endpoints that can only be accessed if you have a JSON web token, you need to make sure that your functions do have the JSON web token on them. So I'm asking for it instead of the options attribute. And then I do before send. And basically, this allows me to set the request header with a JSON web token bearer token. So this part, I literally just got that from a quick Google search on how to add JSON web token to jQuery request, and this is how I got the solution because it looks quite ugly, to be honest, but I guess that's the way we do it. This has no data. The URL is to API/node of type get, and that's pretty much it. It's very generic. So let's add that in so we can start using that. And let's add get user nodes. However, that leaves us with one problem. What happens when you get a user node? So yeah, sure, we can add the data this get user nodes method needs. Like for example, it needs a JSON web token, so we need to pass that in. So JWT token, and we're going to extract it from the state. Remember, we have our entire authenticated user on the state because we fetched it from the cache here. This is what allows us to access the logged in user. So we can do state.authUser and JWT token. That's pretty much it. And then finally, we have to have an onSuccess function. So here's where the problems start to happen. Normally, what you would probably do is write a function here, where inside of it, we inject with jQuery or HTML from the nodes. But I'm not going to do that. That's very messy. And that's what makes these files grow out of control super quick. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use a new component called render. So render is going to be our our new module, which we're going to build right now, and this is going to be in charge of rendering the user's notes. So I'm going to add a new function on render called render notes list. Now, this I don't have yet, so I'm going to write it right now. So let's go to render module, which is understandably completely empty. And I'm going to begin with my usual boilerplate. So window.render module equals, and then inside of it, I'm going to enter my render notes list, which right now is an empty function, but that's okay. Let's just quickly add our function back in. So this function is going to be executed automatically when the get user nodes HTTP request succeeds. So I know my API, I built it, my Node.js server, so I know it receives an array of nodes. So I'm going to do nodes.map to create a new array of nodes using a really nice and handy function I have here called note to HTML, which is right here on line 9. So each of the node objects is going to be converted with this function right here that receives a node object and returns an HTML string template. And then once I have my array of string HTMLs, I join them with an HR element, which basically is just like a divider element. And this allows me to get just one giant string of nodes HTML. And the way each one gets converted is also quite simple. It extracts things like the node content because my space is kind of limited. Imagine the node has a very large content, like it's like 5,000 words. So what I do is I check if the length is greater than 120 characters, and if it is, I crop it using a substring method that you can also look up on Google if you want to learn more about how substring works, and that allows me to crop the first 20 characters of the string and save it into a variable called node summary. Then from there on, it's also self-explanatory. I just inject my node ID, node title, node summary, node and also more information like who created the node.user.name, and when it was updated. I do have to do some extra logic, like for example, because the updated date is a weird string, a datetime string, I need to do new date and then convert it to local date string, which logs something like December 13, 2018, something like that. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the render nodes to HTML. So let's leave that as is, and we should pretty much be done with this. So let's save this page and see if there's anything we're missing. I do not think so, but the best way is to just run it and see if it crashes. So let's refresh the page and hope for the best. Okay, so no errors. Let's check our network panel. So we can see that a node HTTP request was made to localhost 8080 of API/node. It returned with a status code of OK, and the response looks like an empty array because there's no nodes registered to this user. Like, yes, we have nodes, but they don't belong to my user. So it's time to enable functionality to create nodes. So to do that, it's also going to be like kind of more than the same because we finally used all the components we need. So let's just continue the pattern, which is creating a new view for the creation. So let's do a new node folder here called node. Instead of node, that's where we're going to be adding all our logic. So we're going to add first create.html to create nodes. The content is going to be pretty standard by now. So it's just a simple HTML template, and inside of it, we load our CSS or Google font. We load all our JavaScript boilerplate, and then we have a very basic menu saying back to home, create new node, and then a basic form that has the title of the new node and the content of the new node and a submit value. So that's pretty much the create form. Let's add the create page JS, which is out on line 34. So let's do that right now. Let's add new file, create.page.js. And this one is going to be thankfully super clean thanks to all the structure we have by now. So we create the state, we import all the modules in case we need them, and then when this page has done loading, the onReady function gets called, and then instead of it, I do two things. I fetch, remember, because we cannot do anything on our server unless we have a JSON Web Token, we again extract the authenticated user from the cache, and then using this authenticated user, we can actually make a request to the endpoint to create basically a new user, which we're doing here. So here we're listening to basically on click events on submit events that get triggered by the new node form, which we can see right here. So I'm going to just move this below, like so. So here we're listening for submit events by the new node form, and then we're executing on create submit, which if we add it back in is going to be also very similar to what we've seen by now. So it's a simple function that does event.prevent default, so it doesn't redirect us. Then we create a new node from the title and content from the form, as you can see right here. And then I call a new method that I don't have yet, that I'm going to add, called HTTP create nodes. So let's add that right in. And you know what? I'm just going to add all my HTTP methods now, because it's getting kind of repetitive, but we're still going to just revisit this as we're reviewing this. So we now have all our HTTP methods. We could have easily done this from the start, and it would have actually saved us quite a bit of time to write all the functions for example, getting user nodes, get one node by ID, and the create a node, which are just they just change depending on your server side requirements. The only thing in which they don't change is most of them require the JSON Web Token. So make sure you pass it into the ones that do require it. So with my create my HTTP module completely finished, I should now be able to call the create node. I pass in the JSON Web Token when I try to create a new node. I pass in the new node I'm about to create, as shown here. And then on success, if we were successful creating the node, we want to normally we would like to visit the node details view. So this is the view that gets called when you want to just click on a node, and instead of editing it, you just want to view the details. But we don't have the logic yet, so we're going to add it very soon. So for the time being, we're just going to redirect to home. So let's just do window.open, and let's redirect to /home, and let's do it _self. We will add this functionality back in very, very soon. And then that's pretty much it. That's form creation in a nutshell. So let's try this out and cross our fingers and hope it works. So let's refresh the page. Okay, click on create new node. That takes us to the URL node/create. Let's try creating a new node calling workshop node. And then content, learn Frontend. Let's add create new node. Node created successfully, redirecting. And if we go to our Robo3T instance again, so I'm going to open Robo3T to show you how it in fact was created. I go to collections, nodes. You can see that my second node in fact belongs to my new user called workshop node, learn Frontend. And we can see that it's actually here. It's fully visible. It's pretty much our node template. Right now, of course, it doesn't work. What happens when you click on delete? We didn't add logic for that yet, and we haven't added logic for logout or what happens when you click on it. So we're going to do that right now. Now, first, let's add functionality for what happens when you click on a node. So let's add that back into a new view called let's call it details.html. So let's call it details.html. Let's move it to our HTML mini workspace, like so. And details this time around is going to be relatively simple in that it's not going to have that much logic. It's just going to import all our modules first, like so. So let me just close my create page. Let's add, whoops, wrong. Oh yeah, that was a correct one. Kind of panicked there. Let's do details.page.js. Let's close auth because we don't really need auth open at the time. And we will begin by adding the usual boilerplate, which is the state and all the modules. So far, this looks very familiar, except we now have a new module called etc. So this etc. module I will be using very soon, because if you remember, we commented this line out. We're going to uncomment it now, so that when you create a node successfully, you're going to be redirected to a new URL called node/details.html. So this new view we created. And inside of the URL, we're going to add a new query string that adds the ID inside of it. So we're going to be adding the ID into the node, into the URL. And then to extract this ID, we're going to use a really nice and handy function called this etc. function you will be seeing very soon. So I'm going to just add this entire chunk of code. And before that, let's just populate what the details view looks like, because I think that's going to clear up quite a lot of things. So the details view will be surprisingly barren. So notice how literally the body, there's almost nothing here. Like the body is just the CSS, text saying back to home, and then the node details is completely empty because we don't really know what's inside of the node. So we're just going to show a loading in italics. In the meantime, we will be rendering that very soon. But yeah, going back to our details page example, the actual code that runs whenever you visit this page is going to be short, but also kind of complex. So first things first, when you arrive to the page, it does the usual. It does the get authenticated user from cache to get the JSON web token. However, this time around, we're adding something new called etc. get query string param. So this is a function I'm going to add right now to our etc. module. It's kind of a complex function. This is the only one I'm really not going to go into any detail because it's actually quite advanced or complex. And basically what it allows us to do is it allows you to extract query string properties from the URL of the page. For example, if you were at this URL, and you do this function, it returns just the actual ID. So that's what this function does. So don't really put too much effort into understanding it. I even added where I grabbed this function from because this is very common. This is something you do quite often. So yeah, let's just leave that in there. So we extract the ID from the URL, and then because we want to view the node's details, I'm going to do HTTP get node by ID. So that's the next function we added. So it's this function right here, get node by ID. So I call this function with my node ID that I want to fetch, and then onSuccess function. Now the onSuccess is where things might get kind of weird because I have a new method called render node details. So render node details is a brand new function we have to add to our render module. So let's add that right now, render node details. And basically this function is the one in charge of actually rendering the HTML of the node. So it's going to have a button saying edit node. It's going to have a header 1 with the node's title. It's going to have a brief overview of who created it, and also the last update date of the node, and also the node's content. So that's pretty much it. That's going to be rendering the node once it retrieves it. And finally, we also have to add logic for what happens when you click on edit nodes. So we add a just very basic function, node details on click. So when you click on the button for node details, it will call the onEdit node button click. And this onEdit node button click literally just redirects you to that URL. This time, instead of node/details, it does node/edit. And it's going to load the edit version of the node. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that. I believe we're pretty much done. But before we actually test this out, I want to add just one tiny piece of logic to our index.js page. And it's going to be what happens when you click on a node item. So I'm going to add that in. So I'm going to add a new event handler called node list on click on a node card and execute a node card click, which is going to be this function I'm going to add right here. So it's this handy function. Where can we add it? Let's add it. Oops. Oh, excuse me. Moved my mic. It fell on me. Now, let's add that function back in on node card click. So when you click on a card, or basically when you click on one of these nodes, it's going to extract the node ID from the node. And this is something we can actually do thanks to our render nodes list. So when we render the nodes list, this line is the key to why we can navigate to one node by clicking on it. Basically, each node has its ID embedded as an attribute. So the HTML standards has a lot of pre-built attributes like ID, class, hidden, required, input type, and so on. However, it allows you to create your own input types, your own data attribute types. However, well, you can name them whatever. It is heavily recommended you always append data before it, because you never know if the next version of HTML will introduce something that will break your attributes. So just make sure you name whatever you need to attach to the HTML, any information you want to add to it, prepend it with data /dash. So I add my node ID to each node, and then with jQuery, I extract it using jQuery's.attribute function. So that allows me to get the clicked note ID, and then I can just go to node/details.html and then append the note ID. So that will take me to that actual node. And that's pretty much it, but I'm also going to add one last function because it's kind of silly that I don't add this considering how ridiculously easy it is to add this. So here's my onLogout button function. So what happens when you click on the logout button? So I'm going to add that in my listener, as so. And what happens when you click on logout is actually quite simple. I call the confirm function. This is a native HTML5 function available on all browsers. And it allows you to show basically an alert that has a yes or no button. So if the user confirms, it gets saved into the variable you output. So if the user confirms that they want to log out, then it does cache delete authenticated user from cache. So it calls the function delete authenticated user from cache, which basically just wipes out all their information from the cache. And then it just redirects them to login because, well, you're no longer on the home page, so I might as well take you out of the page and just go back to the login page. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's save this. I'm fairly certain it should crash because I don't really trust myself to not have made a mistake this whole time. But let's just see if this runs on the first try. So let's refresh the page. Okay, so far so good. Let's click on the note and see what happens. And there we go. As soon as the page loads, it extracts the ID from the URL. So I'm just going to click on details page and debug this to show you what it looks like in slow mo. So when I refresh the page, the first thing that happens is it extracts the ID, this ID from the URL, and it saves it into this node ID variable, as you can see right here. Then the next thing is extract the authenticated user from the cache. So it's in the cache, local storage cache is all of this. So it extracts that and saves it into state.auth user, as you can see here, included my JSON web token. And then I just do get node by ID. I attach the node ID I want to fetch, as well as the render.render node details function, which basically is a function that will be run whenever you actually try to render. So then I'm going to add a debugger breakpoint on that render node details function. And I'm going to press play. And you can see that it receives the node that is going to be rendered, and it just injects it into this HTML page. And that's what allows this to actually work. And this should actually work even once we create a new node, like we uncommented out previously. So we do a test node number 2, test content number 2. And let's just create a new node. Node created successfully, redirecting, and this time instead of taking us to home page, it takes us to the details view of that node we just created. So we can see the node, we can read it, we can click either back to home or edit node, which of course will not work because we haven't created that view. But let's add that edit node because that's pretty much more of the same. Just getting the node, this time making it editable and giving us the ability to save new details about that node. So let's create our final view, which is the edit view. So let's do here, let's do node, new file. Let's call it edit.html, and inside of it, paste the usual amount of boilerplate. So this time, the boilerplate is just more of the same CSS file, the same Google fonts. The JavaScript is as well. We import all the components we made up until this point. So we import jQuery, all the modules. So that's etc., cache, render, and HTTP, and then finally our edit page.js, which we'll be creating very soon. However, notice how the form, this time we do have the form pre-built. So we have the form called node edit form. We have the title and content. However, we have two very big differences I want you to see. So the first thing is I make both of them required because the user needs to fill them both before submitting the node. And number two, they're both disabled by default because I do not want the user to type anything when he first arrives on the edit page. You will see why very soon. Now I will add my new file, my new JavaScript for edit.page.js. And I think that's pretty much enough for now. So I'm going to save this and test this to see what happens when you click on the edit on of them. So if I go to my home, you can see I have now 2 nodes. If I click on any of them and then I click on edit node, it should take me to a blank page. But they're both disabled. And that's okay because I do not want the user to try to edit either field until I actually load that node's information. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to load the data of the node into each of these inputs, and then I'm going to make them editable. So let's do that right now. Let's add a new, let's add the code for the edit page, which is going to look a bit like this. So first, use your boilerplate, which is importing all the modules, writing our document on ready function. And this time around, we're going to have our on ready function kind of similar, but at the same time kind of not to the details view. So basically, we're going to have our on ready function. We do the same thing that we did on the details page, that we extract the ID of the behind the URL, and also we extract the logged in user from cache. Then we basically, because we want to populate this node, I make a request to HTTP get node by ID. So the same function I called in my details page to fetch that node. And then once that's done, I do basically an unsuccessful function called render editable node. That's something we still need to add. So let's go to render module and let's add what probably is our final function. And thankfully, even though this looks like the hardest one, it's actually the easiest one to render. So because we already have our form built on the edit page, as you can see here, we don't really need to render anything. We just need to inject the correct value. So instead of title text and content text, so each of these two inputs, so title text and content text, we first remove the disabled property. That way the user, we can tell the user, you can start typing now. So it says disabled to false, and then it injects the value of the node into each input. So that will allow us to finally allow the user to see that node's details. So let's add that in, render editable node. Let's save that, and I'm going to comment this out for the time being, but I want to test this out so you can see how it actually works. So if I go back to home, and I click on a node, and then I click on edit node, it should now first show disabled, and then it populates it with the actual data. So far we're doing great. Now it's time to actually save the changes once you click on save changes. So let's do that because we're getting so close to finishing it. So let's just wrap this up by adding our final function for edit. So it's going to be the function that gets called when you click on the submit for the form, which is called on edit submit. And it's going to look a bit like this. So same as creation, you create a new node object from the input forms, and then you call the http.update method, which is this one right here. So this one is kind of a complex one because for updating, you need to be authenticated with a JSON Web Token. You need to provide the ID of the node you want to update. You want to provide the new node object that you wish to use to do the update, and the callback for unsuccess or on error of the request. So it's a lot to take in. So we just provide them, thankfully, because we have all of this in the state, thanks to these handy functions we wrote on lines 11 and 12, which grab the ID of the node and grab the authenticated user from cache. And using this, we can now pass in the node ID. We can provide the new node we want to use to update, the JSON Web Token to prove we're authenticated. And if we are successful, we alert saying node changes saved successfully, redirecting. And then we do window.open, and we take us back to the node details page to prove to the user the node is now up to date. So here's the node details. And if an error happens, just standard run-of-the-mill error log. And that's pretty much it for the edit form. We're pretty much just about to wrap up here. So let's just quickly try to edit a node. So workshop node is going to be edited to workshop node number 3. And learn frontend number 3. Click on save changes. Node changes saved successfully, redirecting. And you can see that it now loads the details view of this node. Now change to workshop node number 3. And if we go back to home, it modified it to be workshop node number 3. So with that said, we're pretty much done here. We only have one super tiny thing we need to finish. It should take us less than probably a minute or two. And that's deletion of notes. You want to be able to delete notes as well. So let's add our final function, which is called the Undelete node button click. So I'm going to add that event listener right now. So that's going to be placed, how about here? And now I need to add in the function. So what happens when you try to delete a node? So this might sound like it's actually quite simple, but it also has quite a few steps you need to take in order to actually delete it in the proper fashion. So to delete it, we first need to do something very weird, which is to event.stop immediate propagation. The reason why we do this is because in a render, when we render each of these node summaries, the delete button is actually inside of an entire node card. However, we have another event handler that's listening for events on node cards. So if we look at this, this is listening for events on node cards. So there's a jQuery event listener listening to this entire component, and another one just listening to this component. But because of the nature of events, events bubble up. So it will fire, if you click on the delete button, it will fire both the delete event handler as well as the click on the node event handler. So to prevent that, we do event.stop immediate propagation, and that stops the event from bubbling up. So that way it doesn't fire the on node card click event. So with that said, now it's just a matter of doing a few things. So we need to extract the ID of the node we want to delete. So because we clicked on the delete button, we need to use jQuery to navigate to the parent that has the node card ID. So we do jQuery.closest, that searches the DOM upwards, finds the node card element, this one on line 17 on render module, and then it extracts the ID of the node you want to delete. So it extracts the node ID from the attributes as we did previously, and then using this node ID, it finally asks the user, hey, are you sure you want to delete this node? And if he says yes, if user said yes, then we finally call our final HTTP method, which is http.delete node, which is basically just the typical run-of-the-mill method. It includes the node ID you want to delete, the JSON web token to prove you're authenticated, and the on-success and on-error callbacks, which in this case, it doesn't really do much. Just give the user a useful alert saying node deleted successfully, reloading results. And then because this will no longer be up to date, we refresh the nodes list by doing http.getUserNodes. And then once it's done, on success, I just call my render.re-render nodes list again, which is the initial method we had at the start. And that effectively finishes our app. So let's just quickly try to delete a node to see what happens. I'm going to click on delete on test node number 2. If I click on cancel, it shouldn't delete it. As you can see right here, even if I refresh the page, it should still be there. Click delete. I want to delete this node. Yes. Don't delete it. Reloading results. And no more node. And that's pretty much it. Just before wrapping up, I want to show you how Logout works. So right now I have all my user information stored in the cache. But if I click on Logout, if I click cancel, nothing happens. But if I click yes, it's going to wipe all my information, user information, and take me back to login, as you can see right here. And that's pretty much it. Wow, that was tight on time, but we made it barely in the hour. So let me stop recording right here, and we can start with the Q&A session of the workshop.